Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? You guys sent in some really interesting stuff about traditions this time around.
Yeah, definitely some thought-provoking sources.
For sure. And, prepping for this,
Mm.
I realized that I kind of just accept a lot of traditions without really thinking about them.
It's easy to do, right? They're so ingrained in our lives.
Totally. But the thing that really stood out to me from these sources was how many traditions we consider like set in stone are actually, uh, well,
Based on some pretty shaky ground.
yeah, exactly. Outdated ideas or straight up myths.
Like that whole appeal to tradition thing. Just because something's been done a certain way forever doesn't make it right.
Right. It's like, we've always used leeches, so they must work. Kind of scary when you think about it that way.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, like, what other things are we clinging to that don't actually make sense anymore?
Well, speaking of outdated practices, one of the sources actually talked about how the 9 to 5 workday might be hurting productivity.
It's a classic example, isn't it? The 9 to 5 was designed for factories, not the way our brains actually work.
So we're stuck with this leftover from, like, the Industrial Revolution.
Pretty much. Now we know people have different peak performance times, and being more flexible actually works better.
Okay, but then how come it's so hard to change? Like, what makes us hang on to these things, even when all the evidence says we shouldn't?
Well, there's a few reasons,
Lay
actually.
on me.
You've things like cognitive biases. For example, confirmation bias. We're more likely to believe information that supports what we already think, even if it's based on something shaky.
Ah, so it's like we're protecting our own worldview, even if it means holding on to something that might not be good for us.
Exactly. Plus, there's also social pressure.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the one to, like, rock the boat.
Right. Especially when it comes to traditions that are deeply ingrained in our culture or workplace.
It's just easier to go along with it, even if you have doubts.
Easier, but not always better for us in the long run.
True. So those are some of the reasons why traditions stick around, even when they maybe shouldn't. But let's get to the fun stuff, the myths. The sources you sent are full of them.
Oh, yeah, we could do a whole deep dive on myths alone.
Where do we even start? Vikings? Napoleon? Columbus? Give me the good stuff.
Okay, let's tackle Vikings. You know that classic image of them with the horned helmets? Turns out, totally made up.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. There's zero historical evidence they ever wore helmets with horns. Seems to be a 19th century invention. Maybe artists got inspired by Greek or Roman stuff.
So basically, artists decided to make things more dramatic, and now we've got this totally wrong idea about Vikings.
Yep. It just shows how easily these misconceptions can become part of like our collective understanding of history.
Okay, wild. What about Napoleon, then? Everyone always says he was short.
Another myth. He was average height for his time. The whole Napoleon complex thing. That's a mix of mistranslations and his enemies spreading bad PR.
Wow, so even historical figures get caught up in these fabrications.
It happens all the time. You start to wonder how many other things we think are historical facts are actually totally distorted.
Right, and it's not just history. One of those articles talked about how the whole father giving away the bride at weddings is based on the idea of women as property.
It is, yeah. Back then, women were considered their father's property and then they were transferred to their husband.
It's a pretty stark reminder of how traditions can reflect these outdated social norms.
For sure. Thankfully, our views on gender roles have changed a lot since then.
Yeah, but the tradition's still around.
Right. Like a lot of traditions, it's evolved to take on new meaning over time.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, how many other things we just accept without questioning might have these kind of messed up origins?
More than we realize, I bet.
Definitely makes you want to take a closer look at all those traditions we take for granted, right?
Absolutely. It's like we're peeling back layers of history, like an onion. Finding all these hidden meanings and old assumptions behind the stuff we do today.
Yeah, and like we've been saying, one of the most important tools for that is critical thinking.
Definitely. It's more than just questioning things. It's about having a method for evaluating information.
Okay, so how do we actually use critical thinking when we're looking at traditions?
Well, one key thing is examining your assumptions.
Hold on, break that down a little. What does that even mean, like when we're talking about traditions?
It means asking yourself, what beliefs is this tradition built on? Where did those beliefs come from? Are they actually backed up by anything or just something we've always accepted?
Okay, I think I'm getting it. Like, one of the sources talked about standardized tests.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
The article was saying standardized tests might not be a good way to measure a student's ability.
Right. They're based on this idea that there's one right way to test everyone. But research shows they favor certain types of learners and are affected by things outside of a student's control.
So by really looking at what standardized testing is based on, we can start to see where it falls short.
Exactly. And then we can start to explore different ways to assess learning that might be fairer.
Okay, that makes sense. What other tools are there for thinking critically?
Well, once you've examined those assumptions, the next step is to be willing to challenge authority. I don't mean like being disrespectful or anything.
But just because someone important said it or it's an old tradition doesn't mean it's right.
Exactly. Even experts make mistakes, and traditions can become outdated. Like that saying, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Love that quote. So we've looked at our assumptions, challenged the experts. What's next?
Now we look at the evidence. Ask yourself, what facts support this tradition? Is there any real proof to back up the claims?
So we got to dig deeper, huh?
Yep, like a detective. And just like a good detective, you've got to consider different viewpoints too.
Get all sides of the story.
Right. Look for different opinions, listen to different people, and understand the history and culture behind the tradition. That helps you see the whole picture and avoid jumping to conclusions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these critical thinking tools can work together to really understand a tradition.
It's about thinking things through, not just blindly accepting or rejecting.
This is really making me think about traditions related to culture and religion. Those feel a lot harder to question, you know.
That's a good point. They often mean a lot to people, and we have to approach those conversations carefully.
So it's not about telling people their beliefs are wrong, but maybe just trying to understand them better.
Exactly. We can ask questions like, what's the historical context? What values does it represent? Are there any downsides?
By asking those questions, we're not trying to change anyone's mind, just trying to encourage a deeper understanding.
And sometimes that can lead to positive change. We might realize a tradition isn't doing what it's supposed to anymore, or even causing harm.
Like traditions around gender roles, for example. A lot of cultures have long-held beliefs about how men and women should act, and those can lead to bad stereotypes and limited opportunities.
That's a great example. By using critical thinking, we can understand how those traditions formed and decide if they're still relevant and beneficial.
It's about recognizing that traditions can change as we learn more about the world.
They're not set in stone. They can and should adapt.
You know what? This whole questioning traditions thing is kind of empowering.
It is. It gives you control over your own beliefs and actions instead of just blindly following what you've been told.
Yeah, but it's also kind of scary, right? I mean, people might not like it when you start questioning things they hold dear.
True, it can be uncomfortable. It can feel like you're rocking the boat. So it's super important to approach these conversations with empathy.
Like, remember that people often hold on to traditions for really personal reasons, like feeling connected to their family or culture, or just wanting to hold on to things that feel familiar.
Exactly. Before you jump in with all the critical thinking, remember that and be respectful.
Right. And we have to remember that we all have blind spots, too.
Hmm.
We might be holding on to traditions that we haven't even examined ourselves.
We're all on this journey of learning and unlearning together.
And sometimes the most important lessons come from challenging our own beliefs and being open to new ideas.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about growing and changing. We're always coming across new info and new perspectives that challenge what we think we know. The key is to stay curious and never stop questioning things.
Like we're all students, always learning.
And critical thinking is the tool that helps us make sense of it all.
This has been awesome. I feel like I have a totally new way of looking at traditions now. It's like we've gone from just blindly accepting these traditions to seeing them in a whole new light.
Right. We can appreciate them, but also see where they could be leading us astray.
And we've learned that critical thinking isn't about, like, getting rid of traditions entirely.
It's about giving us the power to choose which ones we keep and why.
Because traditions are always changing, right?
Yeah, we have to adapt.
And sometimes we have to take a look and see if they're still working for us or if they're actually doing more harm than good.
Like we were talking about earlier, something that made total sense in the past might not make sense now.
Like, what about saying bless you when someone sneezes?
Oh, yeah. That one comes from way back when people thought a sneeze could, like, make your soul escape.
Not exactly scientific.
But the saying stuck around.
So now it's less about souls and more about just being polite.
Exactly. Traditions can change their meaning over time, but still connect us to the past.
Okay, so what does all this mean for us? Like, how do we actually deal with traditions in our own lives?
Well, we can't just accept them without thinking. We've got to be thoughtful about which ones we follow and why.
We get to decide.
We do. It's about taking control instead of just going with the flow.
That's kind of cool, actually.
It is. And it all goes back to those critical thinking skills. Question your assumptions, challenge authority, look at the evidence, and consider different perspectives.
So we can choose traditions that really reflect what we believe.
Exactly. It's not about rejecting tradition altogether. It's about being open-minded, curious, and asking tough questions.
And remember, even small traditions can make a big difference.
Yeah, think about your family traditions, the way things are done at work, even little rituals you do at home. By looking at these with a critical eye, you can make changes that align with your values.
It's like tidying up our lives, right? Making space for traditions that actually mean something to us.
And getting rid of the ones that don't.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. It gives you freedom to shape your own life.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I understand traditions in a completely different way.
It's a journey that never really ends.
Right. We're always learning and growing, and our understanding of tradition will keep evolving too.
The key is to stay open to new ideas and never stop questioning.
So to everyone listening, keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep exploring those traditions.
You have the power to choose the traditions that make your life meaningful.
That's all for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See ya.